Hello, AP Micro students. I'm sorry I can't be there today. I'm at cross country, and I still wanted to get started on a couple of things because I know it's homecoming Friday, and I know most people don't want to do a whole lot of stuff, but hopefully Mrs. Weiss had a chance to introduce her AP Gov stuff. But then I wanted to go through a few things that are necessary for us, good things to do while I'm not there, and then I'm going to introduce a concept. I'm going to review a couple of concepts and then introduce a concept. It should be pretty low key, should be pretty easy, but I'm going to introduce it on the video and then give you some time to practice a couple of things. So, good couple of things for us to work on. First thing I want you to do though is to create an Albert IO account. If you don't already have one, you should probably have one. A lot of people used one in previous years for other classes. And if you have an account, that's great. You should get that account. You should go back into that account, log into the account. If you have to make a new one, make a new one. But the main thing I want you to do right now is to enroll in my class. It should be called Navy 1 and then 20 for 2020. And so I want you to enroll in this class. And so the enrollment code is right up here on my screen, 75PEXN10XFGX. So if you need to pause the video, then pause the video. If you need to write that down, please write that down. But try to get that code and join my class for Albert IO because we'll be using Albert IO, and Albert IO is a great resource to use for practice questions. So I'm glad we have that up and running now. We'll also be using AP Classroom for questions. So some of the feedback that I got from people before is we didn't practice enough questions, but we got questions now to practice. AP Classroom and Albert IO. So with that, I want you to make sure that you've joined our AP Classroom. And so this right here, I have 8 enrolled, which is about, I don't know, maybe 10 short. So I got 8 people. And so this is the code you need for AP Classroom. So make sure you get the join code for AP Classroom. So 2 important steps this morning is to make sure that you join, and it's actually a requirement. You have to join AP Classroom because we do all of our test ordering through AP Classroom. And so the roster I have in AP Classroom is the roster for people who get a test at the end of the year. So make sure you use that join code up at the top, ZW693E. Join that so you're part of AP Classroom. Okay, so I'm going to one more time show you these two. All right, so AP Classroom code right there. Make sure you get that one down. And then Albert IO right there. Make sure you get that one down. If you're watching this and you're in my other class, I will show you the 2 for that one. All right, so Navy 2. This should be ours, I think, right here. Okay, so Navy 2, this is the one to join. All right, so Navy 2 2020. Here's our join code right there. Pause the video if you need to pause the video. And then here is the Navy 2 join code for AP Classroom, 377NZA. So everybody now, Navy 1 and Navy 2, should have all of the join codes necessary for Albert IO and AP Classroom. Okay. All right, that's all I'm showing from this website. So I'm going to review a couple of concepts and then we will introduce one new concept. Okay, the concept that I wanted to review, well, I wanted to review 2 major concepts. Now these are not the concepts I want to review, but if you do not remember how price and quantity are related for demand and supply, you need to figure that out. You need to review that. You need to study that. You need to remember when price changes, how quantity changes for the demand and the supply curve. And then you also need to figure out how outside factors and what our outside factors are that shift the supply and demand curve. If right now, at this point, right now today, you do not know what caused the change in quantity supplied or quantity demanded, and you don't know what the difference between that is and a change in the supply curve and the demand curve, you need to go and figure it out. All right, so you need to read through your textbook and you need to find the review packets. I cannot spend time reviewing these very simple concepts, but if you don't know it, nothing is going to make sense as we go forward. So please figure those things out. That would be great. All right, so the things that I am going to review now are going to be elasticity and then producer and consumer surplus. And those 2 things are really important because they're important for the concepts that we're going to introduce here in just a second. All right, so the first one is elasticity. And remember, elasticity is the measure of consumers and producers' reaction to a price change. All right, so how do they react when prices change? Okay, so when prices go up, when prices go down, how do consumers and producers react? Okay, so if we're talking about the demand and the price increases, we know that the quantity demanded goes down, but the question is, does it go down by a little or does it go down by a lot, right? So if it goes down by a little, we call that inelastic. The reaction is very small. If it goes down by a lot, we call it elastic. Okay, and so those two kind of very simple reactions, either people react a lot when the price goes up or people react very little, help us then figure out a couple of things. So if the price goes, let me go back just a little bit. If the price goes up and people react just a little, what happens to the revenue, right? So it's an inelastic, right? And price goes up. We know that the revenue is going to go up. Why does the revenue up? Because the quantity demanded only went down by a little bit. Whereas if it's elastic, right? If it's elastic and the price went up, we know that the revenue goes down because the quantity demanded dropped by a lot. Lots of people stopped buying it. Those concepts should be pretty straightforward to us. And then the final thing that we did with elasticities, we talked about how to basically calculate it. All right, so how do you calculate elasticity? Well, we were comparing these percent changes. And we remember that if we get a value of something like 0.5, right, that value is very small. And that value should tell us that the reaction was small. All right, so what does that mean? That means if we had a 10% change in the price, we must have had a small reaction to get 0.5. All right, so that meant the 5% change in the quantity must go like that. All right, so to calculate elasticity, it is I should do it like this, the percent change in the quantity over the percent change in price. Okay, so that was one of the final concepts that we were doing, and we talked about the different values that elasticity could then take, right? It could take on a value something like 0.5, right? So we said 0.5 would be a value that's inelastic. It could take on a value like 1, and we called that elastic. Sorry, we did not call it elastic. We called it unit elastic. And then it could take on a value like 2, and these are just hypotheticals, right? But less than 1, 1, or greater than 1, and we call this elastic. And then from there, we actually went to the two extremes, whereas if we had no reaction, right? So no reaction to a price change, we called perfectly inelastic. Right? And if we had a complete reaction, or the quantity could change infinitely and the price doesn't change at all, right? So we had no reaction in quantity up here, and down here we have no change in price. We would call that perfectly elastic. So that was the other extreme. We called perfectly elastic. Okay, so those values were important for us to remember. So then, going off of that, those concepts of perfectly inelastic, unit elastic, and elastic, we looked at the slope of each one of those curves. So to kind of just show each one of those, and we're just really talking demand here, but we could do the same thing with supply. So if this is our price and our quantity, and we were trying to show perfectly inelastic, we would say, okay, perfectly inelastic means the quantity is not changing at all. There's no reaction in quantity. So we have this quantity right here. No matter what the price is, we have a demand curve that looks just like that. So it's straight up and down. So that would be perfectly inelastic. Here, I'll change colors, and we could say, all right, well, this demand curve then that slopes pretty steep, that demand curve is going to be relatively inelastic. Still pretty steep, so it's relatively inelastic, right? And then we could have a demand curve that is something like that, and we could call that one relatively elastic. And then we could have a demand curve that is perfectly flat, and we could call that perfectly elastic. Okay, so kind of the different slopes of these demand curves indicate how elastic or inelastic these different demand curves are. And that was kind of one of the last things that we looked at when it came to the graphs, is how much slope there was within that. Okay, so those concepts should be really nothing new to us. And what we're going to do with it, we'll come back to this elastic concept hopefully towards the end. If the video takes too long or we go through too much stuff, then we'll get to it next time. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to review one more concept, not with elasticity, but with producer and consumer surplus. So I'm just going to abbreviate producer. I didn't want that in green, so we'll go producer surplus and consumer surplus, just to review that concept. Okay, so if we look at our graph, and we have our price and our quantity, and we have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. When we look at these concepts of producer and consumer surplus, remember, it's the difference between what they did pay and what they would have paid, right? So the curve itself represents the would have, right? So these two curves represents, I say would, but the real idea is willing and able, right? Willing and able to sell, willing and able to buy, right? That's what the two curves itself represent, right? So remember, this guy up here would be willing and able to pay a lot for the good, and this guy down here would not be willing and able to pay a lot for the good. And this person up here can't produce until the good is really expensive, till the price of it's really high, but this guy down here, he can be profitable and sell even if the price is really low. And so that tells us what they're willing and able to sell it at. What actually tells me the did, right? What they did actually sell it for and buy it for is equilibrium. So our price at equilibrium and our quantity at equilibrium. We're more concerned right now with just the price at equilibrium. So now what we can do is we can take this demand curve and we can compare what they would have paid and what they actually did pay, right? This should be pretty good for us. So this person would have paid that, but they actually did pay that. So that person gains an extra bonus, right? They would have shelled out $15. They only had to actually pay $5. So they got this thing they valued at $15 for $5. So they're up an extra 10 basically. So that person is up 10, and this person might be up 8, and this person might be up 6, and this person might be up 4, and this person 2. And anyways, you take all of these hypothetical people and you take the area of this entire triangle, and that area is going to represent the consumer surplus, because it's the extra, it's the bonus that goes to consumers. And then we would do the exact same thing with producers, right? So this guy is willing to sell it for this low price, but actually gets to sell it for much higher than that. And the same with all of these people throughout, all the way to where our equilibrium quantity is. So that area represents the producer surplus. So you take those two together and you get what we call total surplus. Right? Remember, this is different than a surplus. A surplus is when the price is too high and the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. Okay, now what we're going to do, and kind of throughout this chapter, we're going to do a variety of things in this chapter, but one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the government might get involved in markets. And today I'm just going to introduce a simple one of how the government can get involved in a market through a tax. Okay, so our assumption right now, though, is that the market is correct, that the equilibrium price and quantity for the market is the right price and quantity. So that's the assumption that we're going to make right now. In the future, we'll talk about how that assumption might be wrong. But again, we're going to call socially optimal. We're going to call that the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so socially optimal is going to be the equilibrium price and quantity. So when we look at this simple thing right here, we're assuming that that is good right there, that that's socially optimal. That point is the socially optimal price and quantity. And then we're going to talk about how we're going to look at how government tax might actually mess this up and make it worse. Okay, because remember, people want that price and that quantity, and we're going to look at how what a tax would do to that. So we'll look at how it changes basically the consumer producer surplus, and we're going to introduce this thing called deadweight loss. So that's what we're going to get to. So let's review just a little bit about what we remember. Remember GOPO, right? So this is government policy, and one of the government policies that we've mentioned is a tax. So we should remember from GOPO that a tax shifts the supply, and it actually, just to add to it, it decreases supply. Okay, so to look at that on a graph, we would show it like this. So we say the government taxes it, and we're going to remember it like this. So price, quantity, supply curve, demand curve. All right, so we have our point of equilibrium right there. This is our price. This is our quantity. Okay, so the first idea is, if the government were to tax this, now we're actually going to be we're going to be kind of specific right here. And we're going to say, remember, this is right here, this is how much that person would be willing and able to sell that good for. But if the government taxes it, what they're doing is they're increasing the costs to produce it. All right, so if before, this guy at $1, he could be profitable and sell it for $1, well, the government might be taxing this by an extra $1. Right? So can this person still be profitable at $1? Not anymore, right? That person can only be profitable once you add on the tax at something like $2, right? And this person right here, before, they could sell at $2, but now with the tax, they can only sell at something like $3, right? And you could take that kind of throughout each one of these. And so we would shift this whole supply curve. Let me go in a different color. We could shift this supply curve up. Up by how much? Up by the amount of the tax. So this is the amount of the tax. So how much does the supply curve shift upward? Remember, this is a decrease in supply. How much does it shift upward? It shifts upward by the amount of the tax. Okay. And now, what do we know has happened to equilibrium? So equilibrium now becomes this point right there, that price with the tax and that quantity with the tax. Okay, so now with this tax and this newly upward shifted supply curve, this PT becomes the new price, right? It becomes a new price. But here we're saying actually they're taxing sellers. Okay, so sellers now get this higher price, but do they get to keep that higher price? Well, no. What do they have to do? They have to pay a tax. And so where does some of that tax go? Well, some of that tax goes to the government. How much goes to the government? Well, the amount of the tax. So the amount of the tax, again, is the height between these two curves, which is this amount right here. Right? So this is the amount that is paid, right? That's the amount paid to sellers, but how much do the sellers get to keep? They actually only get to keep this price down here. Why do they only get to keep that amount? We can put that here. Why do they only get to keep that amount right there? Well, because they got paid that higher price, but they had to give $1 back to the government. So they only get to keep this point down here. So I don't want to get too messed up right here, but this up here is what the buyer paid, right? And this down here is what the seller keeps, right? So it's kind of a mess and kind of confusing right now, but let's show it one more time, and this time we're not gonna we're gonna say we're gonna put this one off to the side. See if we can keep that one there. This time, instead of saying that we're gonna tax the seller, let's say that we tax the buyer, and for whatever reason the demand curve shifts. Okay, so let's see if we can show this one and see how we can compare these two. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go a little bit smaller. Okay, so let's say this is my demand curve, this is my supply curve. This time they're gonna tax the buyer. This is price, quantity. This is my equilibrium. This is price at equilibrium and quantity. So let's say they tax the buyer, right? So before I could spend that amount, but now since I'm paying a tax, I can only spend that amount because I have to pay an extra tax on top of that, right? And before I could spend that amount, now I could spend that amount. Before I could spend that amount, now I could spend that amount, right? So it shifts this whole demand curve down. Let me go a different color. It shifts this whole demand curve down like that, right? I don't like that one. That one's ugly. Let's do it again. All right, it shifts this whole demand curve down like that. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so, well, this one becomes my new equilibrium point right here. Okay, so now right here, this P, that's what buyers are paying for it. So who gets that? Right? Since buyers are paying that amount, that is the amount that goes to sellers. Right? Buyers paid that. But then what else does the buyer have to pay? Right? They pay that, so that's what the sellers get. But then what do they pay on top of that? Right? Remember, they pay a tax on top of that. Right? They pay a tax on top of that. Right? So how much do they actually pay? Well, they pay the amount that they paid down here, but then on top of it they pay a tax. So this is what the buyer actually paid with the tax. Okay, so if we look at this again, this is what the buyer paid with the tax and everything, right? And down here, this is what the seller keeps. It's because that's what they got paid before the tax was implemented. So this is what the seller keeps. So if we can compare these two, I'm not sure how this is going to move, right? So if we compare these two, I know one is much bigger than the other one, but let's look at it. So if we look at it like this, let's see. Right here, for this one, the sellers they only get to keep this lower price with the tax. Same thing over here, right? Sellers only get to keep this lower price with the tax. Over here, buyers had to pay a higher price because of the tax. Over here, buyers had to pay a higher price because of the tax, right? And so it doesn't matter if they're taxing the seller or if they're taxing the buyer. Our answer is it does not. It does not matter who the government is taxing. It does not matter if they're taxing the buyer. It does not matter if they're taxing the seller, right? Either way, buyers are going to pay a higher price. Sellers are going to keep a lower price. Buyers are going to pay a higher price. Sellers are going to keep a lower price. Okay, so instead of having this kind of big mess like this, we're going to simplify it. Okay, so we're going to do a simplified thing, and it is called a tax wedge. All right, so we're going to show the same thing. We're going to do it another time, but this is simplifying that whole process right there. So we're going to simplify that with what we call showing it with a tax wedge. And it's going to show the same thing, except we're not going to shift the curve. We're going to kind of skip the process of shifting either one of the curves. We're going to assume one of the curves does shift, but we're going to show it without that shift. Okay? So to show the tax wedge, what you do is you simply do what we were doing before. All right? So here's going to be our price and our quantity, right? Here's our supply curve and our demand curve. Now, one of the things that we should have learned just 2 minutes ago is that the curve shifts by the amount of the tax. Okay, so if I take a line and I call this line right here, that's the tax, right? So that is what we call just a tax or a tax wedge. So what we're going to do is, if I can, yeah, so what we're going to do is take this tax wedge and we're going to push it in, right? Because remember, this right here is the amount of the tax. Remember, and so that, if I were to kind of draw it in at each spot, remember, it just shifts the curve up. I'm not going to do it where I want to draw, but it shifts that curve up by that amount. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to push it this direction. I'm going to push that blue line in until that blue line hits both of these curves. Okay, so remember, this is the amount of the tax. So if I had a line in here, I'm going to erase it right away. It would look something like that. Okay, now I'm not going to put that line in there because I don't really need that line in there at this point. So what I am going to do, though, is show what the impacts of this tax wedge would be. All right, so I'm going to erase this stuff over here so we can see a little bit better. Not everything wants erased, but that's okay. Okay, so once I wedge that tax wedge in there, I'm going to analyze it like this. So this right here, this price, right, that is off of the demand curve, right? So who pays that price? Well, that price is paid by the buyer. Remember, buyers are paying the higher price because of the tax. Their prices went up. Well, what do sellers keep? Remember, sellers keep a lower price, right? So since this is a supply curve and our wedge hits the supply curve right there, we just dot over from that point, and that is the price that sellers keep. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what we looked at over here. I got a mess right here. Okay, but that's exactly what we looked at over here. Remember, sellers keep a lower price and buyers paid a higher price. So if I can find, there we go. Remember, sellers keep a lower price and buyers pay a higher price. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm gonna replicate that without all of the writing in there. Okay, so just to hopefully put that off right up there. But I'm going to replicate that again without all of the different writing. So if we were to look at it like this, we have the supply curve, the demand curve, equilibrium, price. We put our tax wedge in there like that. Good. All right. So now let's analyze the remainder of this. Okay. So if we were to look at consumer surplus before, remember, consumer surplus was willing to pay, and then before, what they did pay was this point right here. They paid that point right there, but now how much are they actually paying? So willing to pay, now did pay is right there. Remember, they're paying this higher price because of the tax. Willing to pay, did pay. 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 But it stops right there. So our quantity exchange is actually going to stop right there. All right, so we're going to dot down from here, and this becomes our new quantity. All right, it's no longer equilibrium quantity. This is the new quantity. All right, so what is the consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is going to be this area up here. All right, consumer surplus is that area right there. So we'll call that one consumer surplus. Okay, so where is producer surplus? Well, willing to pay, did pay, right? Willing to pay, did pay. Willing to pay, did pay. And so this blue area down here is going to be producer surplus. So producer surplus. So what is the rest of all of the area? Remember, before in market equilibrium, all of this was consumer producer surplus. It was socially optimal. Everybody was happy. Okay, well now think about this for a second. If this blue, let's call it green. If this green line is the amount of the tax, so let's call that tax just for the sake of our example, a $5 tax. And this quantity, let's call that 100. If we tax $5 for every 100, right? We tax 100 times, right? We tax each one $5. What would be this right here? Well, this this would be a $5 tax, a $5 tax, a $5 tax, $5 tax, 100 different times. Well, how do you find that? You take the amount of the tax times the quantity. All right, so if you figured out anything by now, we're finding this area right here. So this area right here is what? Who gets that? Remember, up here goes to consumers. Down here goes to producers. Right here goes to the government. All right? We call it the tax revenue. Goes to the government. Okay? Tax revenue goes to the government. All right. Big question. Drum roll. Anybody know what this yellow area? Well, first of all, let me ask you this. What was it before? Anybody? What was it before? It was producer and consumer surplus before. That's what it was. Now what is it? It's lost producer and consumer surplus. Anybody that's worked ahead might know the guess that it's called deadweight loss. All right, so that's a new one for us. But that one right there is called deadweight loss. Okay, DWL, deadweight loss. That's what deadweight loss is. It's lost producer and consumer surplus. All right, why do we call it deadweight loss? Well, if you think about it like this, there is a consumer out there, this guy, that consumer. He's willing to pay a price. And there's a seller out there, this person. He's willing to sell it for a price. This buyer is willing to spend, let's call it $20. And this seller is willing to sell it for, let's say, $10. Don't you think they could agree on a price? Don't you think they could agree on $15? He's got $20 in his pocket. He'd be willing to take $10, right? They could agree on $15. Why aren't they? Because we have a tax. And that tax is making it impossible for them to exchange. So you have two willing participants willing to exchange. They're not exchanging. That's why this area right here is called deadweight loss. They're good exchanges that should take place. And that is why we're saying that this market is being basically messed up by the government. And so we're not having the socially optimal price and quantity. Okay, last concept. I'm going to just show you maybe one or two of the concepts, and then I'm going to ask you to answer a couple questions. So that'll be it. Okay, so last thing is we're looking at the burden of the tax. All right, so we're looking at the burden of the tax. And so who bears the burden of these taxes? Well, that actually is going to depend upon elasticity. Why does it depend upon elasticity? Because elasticity has to do how much do people react when prices change. Oops. Okay, and so if you're very inelastic, you're not going to be able to react very much, which means you're going to bear the burden of taxes. Right? I'll say that one more time. If you're inelastic, it means you basically keep buying. Right? So if the government taxes something that's inelastic, you basically have to keep buying it, so you're going to bear the burden of the tax. And so we can look at that with different examples, but that's the basic idea right there, is you have to keep buying it even if they start taxing it. Okay? So it doesn't matter who they're taxing, it matters who is more inelastic for who pays the tax. So I'm just going to do an example. This will be our only example, because you guys are smart enough to figure out stuff based upon an example. Okay, so the example that I'm going to use, and you should know the answer already, who bears the burden, but I'm going to show it to you. We're going to do a demand curve that is inelastic, or more inelastic, and a supply curve that is relatively elastic. So what do I know already? I know that the consumers are going to bear the burden of the tax. So let's say the government says, hey, we're going to tax sellers. It doesn't matter what they say. What matters is who's more inelastic. Okay? So we're going to take that example and just show it. So demand inelastic, supply elastic. They are claiming the taxes on sellers. I'm going to tell you it doesn't matter what they say. All right? So let's go over here and we'll show a demand curve that's inelastic and a supply curve that's elastic. Okay, so a demand curve, price, quantity, a demand curve that's inelastic, and a supply curve that's elastic. Okay, so just like that, we have a supply curve that's elastic and a demand curve that's inelastic. So what should we do? All right, so step one is find equilibrium. So let's find equilibrium right here. All right, so this is the price at equilibrium. This is the quantity at equilibrium. What we're looking for is who's impacted the most by a tax. So let's take a different color. We're going to tax wedge this thing. All right, so this is going to be my tax wedge. Remember, it shifts by the amount of the tax wedge. And some people can already see it, right? So before, this is the price paid by the blue that I've got over here is the price paid by producers and paid by consumers and kept by producers. Equilibrium is what was paid and kept because there's no tax at all. Okay. Now, what is this one, do you think? And what is this one? And who reacted more? Who had to bear the higher price? Who had to lose more? We could say. All right. So let's dot them over. All right. So if we dot over from there. What is this one, right? So this red is going to be the demand curve, right? So this is the price that's paid on the demand curve. And what's this green one, right? So the green one is going to be the price that the supply curve, right, that the sellers get to keep. So who had to change the most, right? So buyers' price increased by a lot, and producer's price fell, but it only fell by a little. Now, why is it like that? Well, because the demand curve is very inelastic. And so inelastic means they're going to incur the tax burden. Another thing to memorize is that elastic means they escape the tax burden. Why does elastic mean escape? It means they can run away. The quantity can react a lot. Over here, they incur because the quantity cannot react. Right? The quantity has to stay basically the same. All right, so what would we show here? All right, so if we're showing the tax burden, this highlighted part in red is how much of the tax is paid by the consumer. So this is the tax revenue that's paid by the consumer. And so then what's this green down here? You can probably guess, right? So the green is going to be the tax burden or tax revenue paid by the producer. Okay? Is there still deadweight loss? Yes, there is deadweight loss, right? So this is still deadweight loss. Over here, is there still producer and consumer surplus? Sure there is, right? So you can't really see it very well right here, but this up here, right, would be part of, not all of it, but part of the consumer surplus, and then this down here would be part of the producer surplus. All right, good. Now we should be able to do really anything with that. I could say make an inelastic supply curve and an elastic demand curve, and you should be able to show the same things and who incurs the burden of the tax. Okay, so I'm gonna just show you. I'm gonna list out a couple things that I want you to practice, and then I'm gonna have a couple of questions on Albert.io. So I want you to go to Albert.io and answer the questions that are posted there. I'm only going to have a couple. All right, so just a couple of questions to answer there concerning these tax wedges and things, and answer those. And we'll be back together on Tuesday. I'm excited to have you guys again. Really excited. So I know we can do well, and so let's kind of practice these things. Be ready to ask any questions. I'll pass things out, go through a bunch of stuff on Tuesday. I'll have your calendar, and I'll talk about a couple of different things. Okay, so here's what I want you to practice. So try graphing the tax wedge for all of these things. So have the demand be elastic and the supply be inelastic, and show that one, who bears the burden. Then I want you to get a little tricky. I want you to have the demand be perfectly inelastic and the supply be elastic. Okay? And then I want you to try the demand to be perfectly elastic and the supply to be, let's just say, somewhat elastic. And then the last one, try with supply. So have demand be elastic and the supply curve be, let's just say, perfectly inelastic. All right, so if you can do those, that would be great. If you don't have time today, don't worry about it. I'd rather get you on the Albert IO questions and do a couple of those. But these are good things to be able to practice. This is stuff you got to be able to do just kind of on your own from the practice one that we did. All right, you guys are great. See you Tuesday.